how do we build lives of sustainable impact and passion and purpose?
The Alchemist Kitchen presents Hedonic Calendaring with Jamie Wheal. Jamie Wheal is the executive director of the Flow Genome Project, co-author of the global best-selling books Stealing Fire and Recapture the Rapture. Jamie's an expert in peak performance and leadership, specializing in neuroanthropology, the intersection of culture, biology, and psychology. His consultations range from the U.S. Naval War College and Special Operations Command to the athletes of Red Bull, along with the executives from Google, Goldman Sachs, Deloitte, Cisco, and YPO. His work and thought leadership have been covered in the New York Times, Financial Times, Wired, Entrepreneur, HBR, Forbes, INC, and TEDx. And this is a conversation about hedonic calendaring, the practice of mapping out your entire year around navigating peak states of consciousness, from mild to medium, all the way up to as spicy as you can handle, in service of becoming a less stressed, more joyful, more creative, more productive human. And the key to it all is dynamic periodization. Simply put, you want to weave into your life just enough solid foundational practices combined with weekly, monthly, and seasonal spikes to keep your transformation on a steady simmer. And that's where the alchemy can happen. Click on the link below if you're interested in joining the Alchemist Kitchen Hedonic Calendaring course. And now our conversation with Jamie Wheal.
Jamie, pleasure to be here and in your home in Austin. And just wanted to say that it's been a real pleasure to meet you. And I'm a big fan of Stealing Fire and Recapture the Rapture, which I know you're thick and fast in the release. And how's it all going? I imagine you're a busy man.
Yeah, fantastic. Although I think it's a little bit like when an actor does a film and then they go on the promo tour and it's in their rearview mirror, but it's just coming into the world.
Yeah.
So there's a bit of time lag as far as where I was thinking about it all day versus now where other people are getting to. But that's also the really exciting part.
I'm really excited to dig into this concept of the hedonic calendar. And I'd love to hear how you observed the things that happened in your life and the experiences that you were going through, which inspired that creation. And if you could talk a little bit to that, that'd be great.
Yeah, it came up on a whim. It was a Fat Tuesday for Mardi Gras, and I just wrote a social media post, saying, just reflecting on the notion of the big party before Lent, right? And I remember reading a Tom Robbins book, Jitterbug Perfume, where he talked about that, and he's kind of unpacked carnival being the swearing off of the meat, the carne part, and that sort of party before abstinence being part of kind of an annual cycle of living. So I just started kind of writing that idea of like the value of abstinence, the value of periodic abstinence, and how that shows up in cultures. And then just kind of continued unpacking it into not just the times where we go cold turkey, but where are the times where we actually shoot the moon? Where are the times that we deliberately and intentionally try and create the most profound experiences of our lives? What often gets called kind of our bucket list dreams, but why wait until we're almost dead? What can we do on an annual basis that are these deep resets, deep renewals, deep senses of novelty, challenge, adventure, triumph, all these kind of things. So on the one hand, we had the notions of Lent or Ramadan or Yom Kippur or New Year, New You, kind of, go cold turkey and be on your best behavior. And then these other experiences of deep indulgence, experience, sensation, and in some respects, kind of more or less calculated risk. And then filling in the betweens was kind of the missing piece for me, because it feels like people are good at feast and famine. They're good at, full sends, where they're trying absolutely to blow themselves to smithereens to have the most amazing experience. And then often we get hooked on those things. We overdo them. We do them too much or too often or too intensely. And then we go back to famine. And so the middle sections of, well, what do I do on a day-to-day basis? And what do I do to reclaim a once-in-a-week renewal, some form of secular or sacred Sabbath, one day out of 7 that I can use to remember and reclaim the best I've felt lately. And what do I do once a month where I can say, hey, I carve out a whole day once a month, maybe half a day once a week, maybe a whole day once a month, maybe an entire weekend once a season, and one whole week once a year. And it just sort of seemed like this really beautiful progression of increasing intensity and increasing risk and reward as a way to continually remind us of what we've forgotten and what is our deepest inspiration, because that can be hard to hold on to, and also ways to mend ourselves and patch our bones, because we go through life and we just take a bunch of hits and no matter how well we think we're doing it, we just get those hits come, they find us. And if we just accumulate them without working out the kinks, then we end up crippled over time. And ideally, times to connect with others, times to connect with the people closest to us, our lovers, our partners, our families, but also our bigger community and the wider world. And if we can do that, then we have a kind of a carrier, a way to build our lives intentionally and on purpose that puts us in the path of magic and grace, and adventure and discovery more often than if we were just kind of winging it and just getting, along the sort of gutter ball of life.
That's really super interesting. I guess some people have a challenge with planning and spontaneity. And how do you sort of architect and present that to someone who says, hey, like, I'm Mr. Spontaneous or Mrs. Spontaneous, I just want to go with the flow, and especially talking to flow, and I guess the flow triggers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and obviously if somebody is truly, truly hell-bent on that, have at it. And if your life can remain under-structured and under-committed to other things that don't always support that, I'd say go for it. And in earlier points of my life, we were on an academic schedule, my wife and I, and we would spend 4 months a year living kind of hashtag van life before there was a hashtag for it. And we had our ski gear and our surfboards and our kiting gear, and we would just travel around having adventures. And it was fantastic. And we were amazingly fit and healthy and stoked on adventure, and we'd catch great music wherever we were, and it was easy and effortless. And then I remember having children. And then suddenly I was like, oh, stone me, I'm stuck in this house. And none of the natural, easy, spontaneous ways to have all that happen in my life are currently available. So now I have to do the opposite. Now I have to think, well, how do I build this from scratch? It's a little like, a tidal pool in the ocean versus if you're trying to build a saltwater aquarium. And I was blown away. I had a buddy who was a marine biologist who was trying to build, who's trying to run a saltwater aquarium. And most people think, oh, how hard's a fish tank? You get the goldfish from the county fair and you drop him in a bowl of water and he's probably dead in 3 days, but like, how hard is it? But a saltwater aquarium, you pretty much need a PhD in marine biology to operate, right? Because you're simulating the ocean. What happens naturally out there and is just what it is, to try and recreate that within the confines of an apartment, right, is a very high-tech, complicated project. That's a little bit like us going from, well, I spent a season at a ski resort, or I spent a summer surfing someplace beautiful, or someplace when I was footloose and fancy-free, right? To recreate that in the confines of adult life with roles, responsibilities, schedules, commitments, is actually trickier than it looks. So if you can pull it off just winging it, I'd say keep winging it. But if you have maybe tasted that or glimpsed that at some earlier or freer stage or just phase of your life, and now it feels like it's in the rearview mirror, then I would say that actually planning it and scheduling it can be a really empowering way to reclaim it. And it doesn't have to be something that was in the past or a chapter of our life or something I grew out of, It can be something that we build deliberately. And, another example I always think about is like the freedom within constraints. So people say this about couples therapists will say, schedule your date night or schedule nights to make love. And people are like, oh, no, it should be passionate, it should be spontaneous. That's a buzzkill. But the reality is that it's a little like writing poetry. Some of the most beautiful poetry ever penned was in sonnets or haiku, which are constraints. They're forms. They're like this many syllables, this many lines, this is how it goes. Now create within that. And those constraints can often boost the creative insights that we can come up with. Versus like, I'm a free verse and I don't punctuate and I just write and write and write and I'll call that art. You're like, maybe, You know, E. E. Cummings kind of pulled it off, but he had to learn the rules first too. So I would propose that these can serve as liberating structures, like the ability to take a look at our whole life. And rather than it just being I wake up every day and I'm already in the back seat and I'm just reacting to my text alerts or my emails or the next fire to put out, and I just never find myself in my seat at choice. Actually looking at our whole year and just putting some intention into it can serve as really beautiful checks and balances, reminders, and permission.
Yeah.
You know, so like I'll have on my calendar like, hey, this is our 1 month, we take a whole day. And we've committed that we're going to spend a night under the stars every month, one night as a family. So if I didn't see that on my calendar, that Saturday night would come and go. 9 times out of 10. Just too busy, too tired, never mind. You know, but it pops up and it's like, hey, you said you guys were going to do this. And it's just one night under the stars. Now, where could we go? Could we go to the beach? Could we go to the forest? Could we hit it in the backyard? Doesn't matter, right? But that prompt, right, created a host of great memories.
Yeah. With regards to, say, peak states or the experiences that people can have that you talk about in the hedonic calendar and the sort of the planning stages. Can you talk a little bit to how one may start to integrate that with regards to sort of your day, your week, your month, and your year, and how by sort of proactively planning your, say, 12 months, you can derive, I guess, more sense of meaning from your day-to-day life. Certainly, I think I'm reminded of the Viktor Frankl quote, when man has no deep sense of meaning, he distracts himself with pleasure, and how that relates to more addictive or sometimes less beneficial behavioral habits. And so actually, you know, in planning, we can start to identify the things that are of value to us, as opposed to what might become more, maybe triggered by more, let's call it, better advertising and sort of algorithms that we are used to sort of picking up our phone and seeing.
Yeah, I mean, you know, that's an interesting quote from Frankl.
Yeah.
And I think that actually highlights our deeply ambivalent relationship to peak states. Because in most orthodox traditions, right, what is typically called kind of right-hand paths, there's usually a bunch of thou shalts and thou shalt nots. And the thou shalt nots are usually pretty strong on indulgence, pleasure, hedonism, escape, right? And there's a reason, because as you said, people often overdo it. And when they overdo it, they are less responsible. Their inhibitions are down, their judgment is whacked, all kinds of less than healthy things can happen in that space. And then on the other hand, you have the left-hand paths. And those, both East and West, have generally been sort of, if it feels good, do it, and all of human experience is kind of grist for the mill of growth, development, transformation. You know, all the way to like extreme examples of like Vajrayana Buddhists in Tibet, like meditating on corpses in graveyards, you know, like you're just like, hey man, nothing is sacred, everything is permitted. And that's been a very fringe population, right? But there's an old Zen saying that says, you know, the left-hand paths are the fastest path to enlightenment with the lowest success rate. So you're like, okay, so it doesn't sound like either of those necessarily gets us exactly where we want to go. And there's tons of contemporary research that's showing two things. You know, one is we're all banged up and we're suffering from micro and macro PTSD, the kind of chronic stresses of 21st century normal, plus adverse life events, you know, the real hits that are hard to undo. And the relationship with like psychedelic research on trauma and therapy is showing consistently that peak experiences of awe and affability, all of those things actually plays a really central role in our healing. So you're like, okay, so maybe it's time for a revisiting of that split between right-hand paths and left-hand paths. And what hedonic calendaring does is it actually integrates them to a middle path, because it says, okay, we're going to reconsider a lot of the ecstatic experiences So respiration, movement, sexuality, substances, music, sex, drugs, rock and roll, all the things, right, that have often been, considered frightening and have lots of cultural taboos around them, not because they're bad, but because they're potent, right? And say, okay, we're going to go back over into this domain, but we're not going to do it foolishly or indulgently, right? And then the right-hand part is, and we're going to structure it. We're not just going to say, wheels off, have at it, and hope it all works out. Right? And so that combination I think, offers us a chance to kind of reclaim the broadest spectrum of experiences that are available to us that often can produce wonder, awe, sense of the sublime, a deep remembering of personal purpose, and potentially insights into who we are and how and what we need to do and grow and heal. And then also the juice to do some of that healing and to do it with each other, in relationship, in connection. And at the same time, not go, like we said, feast or famine. Because typically people will be like, oh, I was working a corporate job, I was working 60 hours a week, I got totally burned out, I got sick, I went bankrupt, I got divorced, fill in the blank, life collapsing, that wasn't sustainable. And then I went to Burning Man, or I went to Peru for an ayahuasca retreat, or I did something. And now I am just all in. I just go hopping onto the bliss train, and I'm like bopping along from experience to experience to experience, and I'm chasing what I think I'm going to find at the end of that rainbow, which is never at the end of the rainbow doesn't end. And so the chance for us to say, hey, peak experiences are valuable, essential, often misunderstood, play a deep role in healing. However, right, it's important to layer them into our life in an appropriate rhythm that allows us to make the most of them without distorting or subverting the actual life we were living all along. Our commitments, our work, our family, our relationships. And so that ability to step out and come back, step out and come back, and maintain momentum becomes a really beautiful and powerful way to architect a life of full choice and experience.
Yeah, it's a phenomenal tool, just hearing you talk it through. In terms of the way that we would inquire around what those experiences might be for, an individual who this is, say, new for, where would you encourage them to start looking? Is there and with that, why is this so necessary now as a 21st century, modern liver in the times that we live now, where I guess I'm leaning towards sort of there's become a distrust in certain societal structures, and we're not taught necessarily how to structure and process the information that we're receiving.
Yeah, I mean, that's an infinitely rich and bottomless conversation as to what is going on, and have we lost our minds, or has the world gone crazy? And I think the simplest, just to soothe anybody who's wondering, am I losing mine, is no, the world has, objectively gone crazy. The complexity, the intersecting exponential curves of things are getting exponentially better, and also things are getting exponentially worse, and which is it, and how do I make sense of that and then plan my life? Crazy making. The factionalism and the loss of trusted authority structures is leaving all of us looking for, well, what's going on, and what does somebody I trust and respect think? And those are all fading, from traditional religion and the collapse of the church and the collapse of the religious belief, all the way to, medicine, doctors, lawyers, the Ivy League, corporate space, social media, Silicon Valley, you name it. We're less and less trusting of the folks that used to kind of have a steady hand on the tiller. And at the same time, you asked about these days. E.O. Wilson, the Harvard biologist, has that great quote, I think, where he says, we have Paleolithic emotions, we have medieval institutions, and we have godlike technology. And just that literally we're wired up as hominids. We're 50,000 years behind this curve. If you think about what was our life, we are adapted for 50,000 years ago. 50,000. The last ice age was 10,000. So that's who we are. Just thrust into this world with screens and memes and information and everything everywhere all at once, in our brains, in our minds, and in our hearts. And the godlike technologies. right? We have the capacity to build a Large Hadron Collider and see the origins of the Big Bang, and and posit the extinction, the heat death of the universe, and also look at a cell phone video of a poor guy in a distant city saying, "I can't breathe." And it explodes our minds and brains and hearts all at once. So where we used to just live in our little patch of ground, in our little village or town with our people and our tribe and our stories, doing what we've always done. So just, to give ourselves some love and compassion that we are in curious times. And we're absolutely, as I think, was it Danny Glover's Lethal Weapon? I'm too old for this shit, right? Like, we're not built for this shit, but we're here. And so hedonic calendaring, and really a more integrated experience of having peak states that are expansive, and they are neurophysiologically different than like how we're interacting right now. They have less stress chemicals, they have more pain releasing, more pattern recognition boosting, more well-being and calm and equanimity sensations. We defrag our nervous systems, we discharge all that micro PTSD, we see more, think more, and feel more. And then we get to bring that. We're like, yeah, I remember when I forgot. I mean, the Greeks even have a term for it. They call it anamnesis, which is the opposite of amnesia. So instead of forgetting, we remember. And what we remember is often what is most deeply true for ourselves in our own lives, our purpose, the nature of the world or reality. It's usually something pretty constant. I always think of like the Disney movie Sleeping Beauty, where the kingdom is under a curse. And then the curse is broken, and then like the chef wakes up and he's like about to throw the pot at the scullery maid, and like everybody's back in action. And it's like that. Like peak states, you're like, oh my God, I was right here the last time I was here. I completely forgot in between, but now I remember. And that can be powerfully affirming, because if we spend all of our time just stuck in the day-to-day mundane, the mundane will crush us. The life's a bitch and then we die, and what's the point? But if we spend all of our time seeking or chasing the sacred, right, then the sacred will burn us, right? You don't stand in front of the burning bush. There's like Raiders of the Lost Ark, and like when the lid peels off, like if you're not pure of heart, you will get melted by that, And so and then if we forget to metabolize or ground any of those experiences with the people in our life, right, then we come unglued. So it really is all three of those things that give us a chance to keep on keeping on. Yeah. Like, I don't think there's shortcuts, and I don't think that there's any bypassing the grief of life. Like, it's a baffling, puzzling thing, right?
You talk about it in, I think, Stealing Fire, and certainly in Recapture the Rapture, when you refer to the sort of the ancient Greek sort of terms of ecstasis, catharsis, and communitas. It sounds a little bit like you're sort of talking to that, with regards to the hedonic calendar, and I'd love to hear, you break that down a little bit further so that our listeners can get a bit more intro into that concept.
Yeah, I mean, those are the fancy terms, right? They all rhyme and they sound neat because they're in an ancient Greek, but it's really just healing, inspiration, and connection. And just that, arguably, and in fact, Harvard Divinity School has an outfit called the Sacred Design Lab, and they ran a project called How We Gather, and it was basically studying millennials and Gen Y, and how do these generations, after the age of you just simply believe in the organized religion that your parents did and your grandparents did, like how do these new generations make sense of things? And they came to the conclusion that there were 3 essential nutrients to belonging to a community of faith. And they said it's beyond, becoming, and belonging. So 3 B's for these guys, right? And so the beyond maps very closely to awe, like the experience of inspiration. And the becoming maps to the process of healing, right? Or catharsis. And the belonging is obviously connection and community. And what I think is really important for everybody, for all of us, because we live in effectively a post-religious world, right? It's not that people don't still practice, but just fewer than ever do. And more people, and now that for the first time in human history, the majority of folks in the developed West don't officially identify with an organized faith. But if we chuck the baby with the bathwater and we lose healing, inspiration, and connection, we're all worse off.
Yeah.
So the question is how do we say these are vital social nutrients? And however we come to them, it's really important that we have them in our life. Because it used to be kind of on autopilot. If you simply belonged to an existing community of faith and practice, they had their calendars, they had their rituals. You showed up when you were supposed to, and you got marched through it. Now, many of them had kind of dwindled over the years. Michael Pollan, in his book, How to Change Your Mind, famously called them, he said, all we've got is sort of placebo sacraments these days. Like you go to a confirmation or you go to a bar mitzvah or you go to a wedding. These things aren't necessarily transformative rites of passage. They're Instagram opportunities. You collect some checks, you write some thank you notes, you kind of do the thing, but you're the same person the next day as you were the day before. And the ability to have truly transformative initiations where we basically reset the Etch-a-Sketch. We're like, okay, I am refreshed and renewed. And I now can sort of, shoulder my pack, right? It's a heavy thing. I've been carrying it for a long time. The strap's kind of cut in here and I got blisters. But I can set it down for a moment. I can stand tall. I can stretch my bones. And I can take in the views. And then I can be like, okay, miles to go before we sleep. Let's get back to it.
Let's get back to it. I heard you use the term, I think sort of borrowed initially from Ken Wilber, but it was to wake up, to observe where we are broken, to patch ourselves up and get back in the arena. I'd love to hear you explore that sort of line of thinking, if you would.
Yeah, I think we've been talking about it, right? Which is, and that just the wake up, grow up, show up, maps to the three-part structures we've just been unpacking, which is the wake up part is how do we wake up? We remember what we forgot via having inspired experiences, right? Of the numinous, of the sublime. And we say, yes, right? I remember, right? Or I know this to be true in my bones. The grow up is, typically that experience is, I remember what I forgot, and I got some work to do. For reasons I don't fully understand, peak experiences, you get sort of access to, the worldwide cosmic browser. And at the same time, you kind of get your laundry list of like, here's your homework, kid. And you're like, oh shit, like this. Like on the one hand, like I see things clearly, but I also see things clearly. And it's like, so I've got, amends and dead ends and things. I've got things I've done and shouldn't have, things I haven't done and I'm supposed to. So I come back down, and that's where I do my growing up. I try and integrate some of those experiences. I try and align myself and my life a little bit more with that possibility, even if it was brief. And then the showing up is eventually, again, I do this in relationship. We're tribal primates. None of us live in a closet or a vacuum. So the idea of like, hey, does this work for you? My family, my loved ones, my colleagues, my co-workers, co-founders, whatever that would be. Are we in alignment? Am I in alignment? And then also, if I get that working, and I'm not just obsessed on my own basic needs or survival, and I've got more gas in my tank, then I can expand my sphere of concern. I can go from just me now. Can I eat? Can I sleep? Can I have sex? Can I get money? Can I do whatever I'm trying to do right now? To like, oh, no, I'm okay. I've got more than enough. I experience love and relationship. Maybe that love and relationship generates a family or generates additional people. Okay, now that family's thriving. Can I now take a role leading my community? Can I take a role leading my country? Can I take a role serving the world? And that's this kind of expanding sphere of concern that grows as our stoke level, right? The more gas I have in my tank, the more care and concern. And it's not just geographic. It's not just I can include more people and be of greater service and impact, but I also start expanding my time frame. So I go from me now, right? Like I'm just hungry or I'm desperate to sleep and I'll do whatever I can.
Ego related.
Yeah. To me and mine now, right? Can I just care for my family in a fire or a flood or something like that? To me and mine now and next, can I actually start strategizing for the people I care for and am responsible for? To everyone, everywhere, every when, right? And so now I might be thinking of my ancestors, I might be thinking of my descendants, I might be thinking of everybody's descendants. We might be playing this for Team Human. right? Because, existential risk philosophers and ethicists will actually say that. They're like, hey guys, if we're mapping uncertain and sketchy futures, there's a categorical difference between a period of hardship that we come out the other side, even if there's loss of life and those kind of things, versus an actual extinction event, right, where no more people. Because no more people means not just the people that died, but everyone who ever could have been can no longer. So you're like, whoa, that's a profound responsibility. Yeah. Like, we are literally in this for way more than my hashtag best life. Right? And that actually, at first it can be overwhelming. You're like, holy smokes, that's a lot. That's a lot to take in. But it can ultimately be galvanizing, like valorizing, like, oh yeah, this is a walk-on part in the war. I don't accept a lead role in the cage, no matter how, gilded and padded with velvet. Like, I don't simply want the big house, the nice car, the beautiful spouse, all the things. Like, that is not adequate. That's not a goal anymore. What's a goal is for me to do my unique part, right, for some bigger collective.
Yeah. I find, certainly with myself and sort of my own sort of self-learning, there are lots of things that I thought that I should, need, or must do, often related to my perception of society, my parents, my upbringing, my education, fiscal needs. And what I've noticed in myself is that the more that I've tried to explore the things that bring me alive, or observe the things that I do sort of, I guess, for intrinsic value, as opposed to sort of extrinsically rewarding means, the closer that I feel one moves towards a source is the wrong sort of terminology for, I'm not saying I'm moving towards being an enlightened being, but that pursuit of growth and opening up myself and, sharing those findings with others has transformed sort of an outlook on, how I prepare myself each day, each week, each month. And I guess there's an element of, sometimes you feel that you do things and you can reward yourself for that. And I guess that there is an element which I think you've talked to around sort of, am I a bliss seeker and sort of, or a bliss junkie? At what point does sort of the opportunity to grow and find these new ways of being, and then bringing that back and sharing it, not them prescribing it in a way that basically people are like, I don't want to hear any more of this. Like, how would you lay it out in a way that you could maybe help a partner or introduce it to a group of friends, in your experience?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's that there's that funny quote that's attributed to St. Francis, but I don't think is. It goes, preach the gospel at all times, if necessary, use words. Right, so be the ball, Johnny. Right, the idea of I think embodying it versus spouting off about it. Yeah. And in this age of self-appointed Instagram experts, right? It's pernicious that anybody who has the tiniest initial hit of anything suddenly puts out a farm stand flogging their wares. And that old quote, there is no fervor like the newly converted, right? So I always just say, slow our rolls and let's integrate and let's actually stick with what we ought to do. Because really, if waking up or any kind of idealized spiritual experience, like, what happens when everybody can't write a book about it and hit the workshop circuit? Like, at some point, right, this ideally is considered less fantastical or romantic and more just a fairly straightforward progression of human development.
Yeah.
And then we move from fantasizing about the second coming of anybody or anything, some savior-like experience or person, to the umpteenth coming, where all we're doing is just helping each other stand up, right? Walk tall, and, as Ram Dass said, like, walk each other home. Like, let's do that and stop giving ourselves such sort of, I would say, premature credit for initial hits of things that are vast and limitless. it feels a little bit to me like the Matrix. It's like, like the good news is you can fly like Superman and learn Kung Fu. The bad news is you're in a vat of goo and the machines are coming tomorrow night. Yeah. Right? So we sort of unjack each other. We say, oh, that was a life of quiet desperation inside the simulation. Come into your full self. Like, yes, you're bewildered, you're exhilarated, you're all these things. Hugs, high fives, you get a weekend at the spa. Now, Monday morning, report to work, you're needed.
Yeah.
And I just think there's so much need in the world. There's so much suffering, there's so much sadness, there's so much inequity, there's so much need for heartfelt justice, right? Let's do that. Yeah. Not invent the next widget to have $1 billion app.
Yeah, I can totally agree with that. Sometimes we aim to create businesses, or sometimes we're immobilized creating, taking that step to creating something in our own image because we feel that it needs to be that $1 billion turnover, or, it needs to be valued at this. And the steps aren't necessarily sometimes laid out. I guess I also wanted to sort of riff a little bit around the nature of some people, who may not enjoy their jobs, and so or are they don't perceive that there is a way out from starting to explore what a life of meaning might be. So I'm talking a little bit more to purpose here, because sometimes I think it would probably be quite easy to observe that we might be able to plan, we might be able to have these sort of grander ideas, but then if we're coming back into a 9 to 5, which obviously has, things are changing now, and that sort of 40-hour work week, in a way that it's kind of, I'm just looking forward to the weekend, or my 25 days, or in America more like 14 days holiday. How would you help or lead someone to I guess tune in to that moment of inspiration? I appreciate that you're saying that you can tap into that through some of these peak state experiences, but in terms of a little bit like what you were talking about before, when you sort of discovered these practices on your journey, van life before it was cool, and how now, in a world that has seemingly, for a vast majority of us, learned how to work from home, and sort of how nomadic travel could maybe and work in the new format might sort of work in alignment with the hedonic calendar. So 2 questions there, one around purpose and one around sort of and discovery of, and have you had a think about how maybe that relates to sort of the hedonic calendar as well, making it more amenable?
Well, I mean, it also sounds like maybe the question behind your question is, how do I unplug from the rat race? Like, how do I, right?
Start there.
Something like that, yeah. So, I think one of the simple things, and you hinted at it a few minutes ago, which was when we're living a shitty life, when we don't have access to peak states that remind us of, this is my reason for being, I feel fully vital and alive and here, we tend to subsidize and indulge ourselves with payoffs. We sort of bribe ourselves. Like, I've been working at this shitty job for 60 or 70 hours, so I deserve the nice car, nice watch. I'll blow it on $20 cocktails for a happy hour. I'll chase weekends or even a fancy turnkey holiday because I'm too tired and burned out to conceive of something myself. I'll just try and go and check the boxes of where I saw those cool pictures, or where where was the happening party last year, kind of thing. And I'll tell myself I deserve it. And it's a sort of, it's almost like we're blackmailing our inner selves to keep going. And that typically keeps us firmly in the trap of our expenses expand with our incomes.
Yeah.
So even if in our 20s or in college, you'd be like, oh my gosh, $100,000, what would I do with that much money? And by the time people get to 100, I mean, there's been articles of people complaining about feeling decidedly middle class and under the gun, earning only $350,000 a year in New York or LA. Because I have private school for my kids, and I have this and I have that, and before you know it, and sure enough, it all does go away. Mm-hmm. They don't have that much left over. So the question, I think, is first is, and there's a great book called The Millionaire Next Door, and there's some other sort of or even Small is Beautiful by E.F. Schumacher. There's books on the idea of well, how do we live in a market economy, right? Where I pay to be a knowledge worker or do something else, and I get cash in exchange for stuff, and I don't grow all my own food and build my house, and that kind of a thing. How do I do that without getting sucked into that forever consumer treadmill where I'm always playing catch up and I've always spent my raise before I've ever banked it? So the simplest would be stop banking your income. Get really ruthless about saving more than you spend, because in many respects, money equals time equals choice equals freedom.
Yeah.
So start by actually doing the hard thing in your control, not the lottery ticket, not the killer, unicorn exit. Start with that, and particularly these days, the other thing about purpose is I'm deeply suspicious of find your inner purpose workshops kind of thing. I think I think what I would encourage is find the intersection of your talent and your trauma. So like if you want purpose, find where do you feel the wound of the world most acutely. Mm-hmm. And it's almost certainly because you bleed there too. And that could be child trafficking, it could be abuse, it could be substance dependency, it could be inner city stuff, it could be education, it could be gardening, it could be animal cruelty. Like there's a million things that need help and love and fixing. Which do you feel? And then look at those, and then look at, and what do I have some asymmetrical capacity to impact? It might be that I'm an accountant and I could go and help that nonprofit with their finances. And that's way more than me just showing up, handing out leaflets or knocking on doors. That's an asymmetrical impact, right? Or I'm an artist and I can make ad campaigns that could help something. Take your pick, but it's something more than me just being another warm body thrown at the problem. And just explore, what would it be like for me to put a little bit more energy? And it can be donating, it can be volunteering, it can be anything, but just like, what does it just feel like to explore that space? Mm-hmm. Because that is going to have meaning, and it's needed, and it's used somewhere. I mean, I always think of like Marvel comics, right? Like Thor's hammer, right? Thor's hammer is infinitely heavy for anyone in the universe to lift but Thor. It's like Excalibur and King Arthur, all right? So what's your hammer? What is yours and yours alone to do? And everything else is impossibly hard, right? But that one thing is effortless. Now that doesn't mean it's free from pain, free from risk, because a lot of people will think, oh, if I find my special purpose, right, then I love my job, and I always love to bounce out of bed on Monday mornings, and I get more money than God to get compensated for doing it. You're like, no, that's childish fantasy. It's much more is what can I look my grandchildren in the eye on my deathbed and said, I gave it my best shot, kids. Your turn.
That's a brilliant summary of. For those who may have found it challenging to, identify what's next. I think there's a lot of people who experience that sort of emptiness or that heavy weight of not being sure, or having tried and moved into something that they thought was going to give them something more, only to be met with the same perception of frustration or challenges that they encountered. And I think like there's a concept that we've talked to a little bit around sort of the art of challenge, and a little bit that I talk about with my clients is related to, I truly believe that everyone has a TED talk in them if they're willing to tap into their pain, trauma and challenge, and use that as a way in which to be of service to something greater than yourself, because it's where we are uniquely qualified to talk to, I would imagine. Do you see that in a sort of a similar frame?
No, I'm a little saltier than that, I think. Which is actually no. There's virtually nobody that has a TED Talk in them. Most people should be in the audience listening.
Yeah.
And the same with I've got a book to write. And the same thing with I'm going to be an Instagram influencer. I mean, that's, I think, one of the pathologies of our age is that you're not special, cupcake.
Okay.
And take a fucking number and be humble and of service and apprentice to your passions, to traditions, to service to the broader world. I think there's an awful, somehow, what I'm hearing, again, the question behind the question is, how do we transition? How do we transition from a way of being, a society, marketplaces, professions, careers, and our lives within all that, to what's next, to what's potentially coming? And so I have deep sympathy for anybody trying to unplug, for anybody experiencing the impossibility. Like Krishnamurti famously said, he said, it's no sign of health to be well adjusted to a sick society. And so a lot of people are actually, had been well adjusted. You know, they were playing the games, they were chasing all the brass rings, and then they realized, I can't keep doing this, right? This is literally killing me or making me sick. And so there's an awful lot of dis-ease. Unfortunately, we've seen this mutant bridge strategy, right? Which is, oh, I have these breakthrough experiences of, you know, whatever, peak experiences, healing, etc. And now the very, very first thing that occurs to me, and only me, never been done before, is I think I'm going to hang out my shingle and become a life coach, or I'm going to become an Instagram influencer, or even like we playfully said, hashtag van life.
Yeah.
It boggles my mind that the thing that we did, you know, a decade ago, just for the love of adventure, to be free, like literally not a phone in sight, and not even barely cameras. Like we would document like sunrise, like summit shots. Like there we were on that thing before we skied down it, like something like that. But not like snip, 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 get the lighting right, wait until the sun sets, blah, 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 blah. Like none of that. And the idea that the notion of like vagabond nomad adventuring has now been co-opted by social media narcissism and monetization is tragically, comically puke-inducing. So that sense of, how do we transition? I mean, it's an insanely clogged lane right now of everybody trying to monetize their own life experience and personal growth journeys to the people behind them that haven't yet figured it out. And I would just say that's a self-terminating social condition. That one doesn't pencil out, because we can't have life coaching other life coaches about how to be life coaches at some point, right? That crawls up its own ass and dies the death it should have at the inception. So, I think there's some sense of like, if you're looking for purpose, we said intersection of talent and trauma. Another, I think, good litmus is the thing I'm considering doing, does it fit an archetypal role in societies forever? Am I a healer? Am I a warrior? Right? Am I a teacher? Am I a builder? Am I an artist, a musician, a muse, a magician? Like some, you know, it doesn't have to get Dungeons and Dragons-y, but like that sense of like, if it's always been around, the odds are good that there's depth there, there's rootedness there, and there's probably a socio-cultural need for it. Right? And if, you know, and someone can be a physician and be like, holy smokes, this is crazy working within the big pharma, healthcare, insurance machine, but I am in fact a healer. So like this model might not work, but is there a way I can still take the depth of my training and apprenticing and bring it to the world in a way that's more congruent? Like that's a beautiful inquiry. If I'm doing credit default swap derivatives and this and that, you know, or something that doesn't exist until 5 years ago or 10 years ago, have, you know, a second and third look. Like, is this for me? And even is this for us? Like, is this needed? Do we need to put more energy to that notion or construction?
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant sort of arc and observation of, I think people find that really useful. I think that's a really huge topic that people struggle with, and often, you know, we're challenged because as you said, there's a lot of people telling us, you know, kind of one way of doing it. I really like your sort of notion of life coaches and life coaches and who's at the top of this, you know, of this pyramid. In relation to sort of going back to sort of hedonic calendaring, would you mind sharing a little bit about some of the sort of the daily practices that you know you encourage, and weekly, monthly, and yearly as examples that some of our listeners might be able to take away in relation to that?
Yeah, I mean, you know, we actually playfully in Recapture the Rapture have, instead of the 10 commandments, the 10 suggestions. Like no one's going to listen to anybody these days, but here's some things you might want to think about. And the first one is, number one, do the obvious. Do the obvious. Like there's billions of dollars spent in biohacking and self-help and personal development, and it all kind of boils down, like you don't need the pills, you don't need the supplements, you don't need the gadgets, you don't need any of it. You just need to do the obvious. So sleep more, move often, you know, drink lots of water, eat real food, mostly plants, not too much, you know, get outside, make love, you know, grieve fully, right? Be grateful. And those things on a daily basis make or break your life. and it demystifies the seeking and the searching. Like, we know this. This is everything that grandma sitting on the front porch in her rocking chair would tell you if you came to her sucking your thumb. Well, are you doing these things? If you're not doing those things, kiddo, SSRIs aren't going to help you much. Like, do the obvious. And, I would say, think of a power hour. We actually kind of boil it down to like, what is 60 minutes of your day? In little chunks, not 60, because nobody just has a spare hour lying around, at least as a grown-up, right? So the idea is like 5 minutes here, 3 minutes there, 15 minutes here. Can you put together 60 minutes, which amounts to 1/24th of a day, 4%. That's all it is, 4% of our day dedicated to doing the obvious. Can I spend 15 minutes in body movement? And that could be yoga if you have a yoga practice. It could be foam rollers and fascial massage and that kind of stuff. It could be body weight and calisthenics. It could be primal movement. You can YouTube anything you want. Like, pick one that gives you range of motion, twisting, moving. Doesn't need to be fancy devices. In fact, probably shouldn't be, right? But works out the kinks. Like, that's amazing. 15 minutes of breath work or mindfulness. Setting in, not intentions like fluffy bunny intentions, but like, if I do only these 3 things a day, and just these 3 things, never mind my inbox, never mind driven by my calendar, just like, these are the 3 most important tasks for my day, my MITs, and set those the night before, so I sleep on it and my subconscious brain is processing. So I wake up in the morning and I'm ready to start, not ready to wonder. Like, simple things like that. And you can build out 60 minutes that can totally transform your day. And then you layer in my weekly Sabbath practice of like half a day to actually slow down and deeply connect. One day a month, a weekend, a week, and you suddenly realize, this isn't actually that mystical. It doesn't mean there's not going to be hard times in it all, but it does mean that when I get knocked down, right, I know how to get back up again.
Jamie, thank you very much. I think it's a brilliant place to pause this conversation, and look forward to reconnecting at some point, and best of luck with the continued launch of Recapture the Rapture. I'm sure it's going to be a great success.
Yeah, man. Great to chat.